Hello everyone. Okay, this short video is a summary of the historical timeline for economics. So I'm leaving out a lot of people. This is really just for a principles class. So let me get my image off of here. Okay, so let's generate a timeline. So out here, this is the future. Here's the past way over here. And in the Western tradition anyway, it's normally given that the birth of economics is in the year 1776, an easy year to remember, but not because of the American Revolution or Declaration of Independence, but because of the publication of a book by Adam Smith. Adam Smith's book was called The Wealth of Nations. Actually, we call it The Wealth of Nations, but its true title was... So Smith's book was really an attack on the prevailing theories of his day. So the prevailing theories of his day, which would run back at least 200 years before 1776, was called mercantilism. We don't use that word too much nowadays, but we do have modern day mercantilists still, and you would recognize them as people who are really nervous about trading with foreign countries. They're nervous about what they call the trade deficit, and they want to manage trade, like they would want to discourage imports into the United States and encourage exports. But back in Adam Smith's day, that was the dominant theory. And just to give you an idea of what mercantilism is like, if you can imagine a simple case of two countries, country A and country B, and then under the mercantilist philosophy, nations become wealthy by accumulating gold. And so if you live in country A, the only way to accumulate gold is to dig gold out of the ground in your own country, or to sell something to country B, which from country A's perspective would be an export. And then in those days, country B would have to pay for that with gold. Of course, that makes exports very desirable if you're a mercantilist, and it makes imports really, really bad, because this is what an import would be. Wait, that arrow goes the wrong way. If country A imported something from country B, right, then country A would have to pay for it, and in those days, of course, they had to pay with gold. So if you imported stuff, gold would flow out of your country, and that would be bad. In those days, there was a lot of subsidies for exports and a lot of taxes on imports. Smith's book was an attack on mercantilism, and Smith said nations become wealthy by specialization and trade. This is a rather subtle idea that takes people a little while to grab a hold of, but if you think about it, each of you is in school and you're training to be a highly specialized person. Maybe your major is accounting or marketing or management or economics or computer science or something. It's a highly specialized field. You can't survive on the skills that you would learn in your marketing class. So what you do is you provide your marketing skills to others, and then you trade for the things that you want. If you really wanted to be self-sufficient, your life would be very, very hard indeed, and probably quite short. Anyway, so Adam Smith pointed out that thing, that nations become wealthy by specialization in trade. So he was all about reducing restrictions on trade in every possible way. Then the next person of note comes around 1820, and this is David Ricardo. So David Ricardo is sometimes known as the founder of modern trade theory. And what David Ricardo did is he took the examples of trade given in Adam Smith's book, and he just kind of said, well, these examples are all true, but they are a small subset of all the possible trading opportunities that there might be. But don't think that David Ricardo got everything right. He also wrote a few things that we try not to talk about nowadays because we know them to be wrong. One of them was the infamous labor theory of value. But let's just stick to the things that he got right, and that was the idea of comparative advantage. Another famous or infamous economist around that time period, and I don't have a good date for you, is Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was actually an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he wrote this famous book. Its title eludes me at the moment, but we now have this term Malthusian theory. And the Malthusian theory is this idea that the future is very bleak indeed, because in the future we are destined to have chronic starvation. So Malthus drew this very famous graph. He put years on this axis, and on this axis he put the population. And he said population, if people stay healthy, population will grow exponentially, like this. You know what I'm talking about? It's compounding every year. And then food, Malthus thought that food would grow linearly because we would, bring more acreage into farmland and so forth. And so there'd be more food every year, but population would always outstrip food. And so it was just a matter of time before there would just be barely enough food for everyone to subsist. And if population ever got beyond that, people would starve to death. And this is kind of embarrassing in economics, but Malthus is quoted as saying that the most humane thing to do for people who are starving is to let them starve. Can you imagine? Let them starve. And his logic was that, well, okay, so there's 1,000 people starving, we let them starve to death. That sounds terrible, but if we feed them, they will procreate. They will have children, and those children will grow up, and they will be more mouths to feed, and so forth and so on. So he said, bizarrely, that better to let 1,000 people starve today than have 10,000 starving in the future. Thomas Malthus, what a piece of work he was. So the next economist that I want to bring to your attention comes in 1890, and this is Alfred Marshall. And Marshall is sometimes known as the founder of modern economics, because it was Marshall who put math. Marshall put math into economics. If you look in your textbook, or any economics textbook, about every third page or so there will be a graph or an equation or a table of numbers. And before Alfred Marshall, none of that was true. Before Alfred Marshall, it was just English was just written out, the written word. After Alfred Marshall, everything done in economics is done, of course, logically with language, but also algebraically with equations, and also graphically if it's possible. And now in really modern economics, it's done with multidimensional calculus. So for those of you who hate economics because of the math, you can thank Alfred Marshall for that. So Marshall wrote a little textbook called Principles of Economics, and that textbook was in print until you get out to about 1935, and somewhere in the Great Depression, Alfred Marshall's textbook lost favor. But that's quite a run for a textbook if you think about it. So he was a quite famous economist. And another important thing to remember about Marshall is Marshall had a certain way that he thought about economics, and there were some economists that thought it wasn't a particularly good way to do it. So Marshall was all about equilibrium. It was really common in those days because the sciences that had made the most advances were astronomy. Astronomy. And so in astronomy, it looked like the heavenly bodies were kind of in an equilibrium. Like God sort of spun all the planets, and then he sort of pulled his hand back, and they just kind of spinning like clockwork forever and ever, amen. And you could, with great precision, make what in those days were fantastic predictions about the arrival of the phases of the moon and the arrival of comets and so forth. And so all the other sciences, economics included, sort of modeled their pursuits of their disciplines in the same way. So Marshall thought of economics in kind of equilibrium. One of his most famous models is the model of supply and demand, which you probably remember from high school. Right? You have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity, and then something happens, like maybe something happens that causes the demand curve to fall down in here somewhere, and there's chaos for a little while, but pretty soon a new equilibrium is established here. We get a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity here. And so the Marshallian technique is just to compare the original equilibrium, which was there, with the new equilibrium, kind of trashing my graph now, but right there, the new equilibrium. And that's all he did, from one equilibrium to another. So there was another group of economists, not in the English-speaking world, but in the German-speaking world, down, not in Germany, but in Austria, at the University of Vienna. And they thought that Marshall's technique of comparing one equilibrium to another was not fruitful. It wasn't that they thought it was wrong, not wrong, they just didn't think it would lead to much insight about how the economy worked. We call these economists nowadays Austrian economists, and the difference between their technique and Alfred Marshall was that the Austrian economists thought of the economy as a really dynamic and chaotic place. So they thought of it more like a kind of a chaos, and there were certain people that they call entrepreneurs who would kind of look into that chaos, and they would see the prices of labor and the prices of raw material and the prices of capital equipment, machinery, and then they would observe the prices of finished goods, and they would search around for combinations of inputs to combine to make some output whose value was greater than the cost of the inputs it took to make it. Entrepreneurs, these are the people who create value in the economy. So in the Austrian perspective, it was all about dynamics. So the Austrians studied the dynamics in the marketplace, if you want to think of it in something you can memorize, where Alfred Marshall thought about equilibrium. So this is a kind of an important division in the science of economics. Uh-oh, somebody's calling me. Just a minute. Alright, that's alright, President Obama. You can call me anytime. As long as I don't have students in my office, I'll be happy to talk to you. Remember now, just do what I've advised you and things will be okay. Alright. Goodbye. I'll talk to you later. Alright, class. Sorry for the interruption. So we were talking about Austrian economics, where it created this kind of division in the history of economic thought. And then, of course, the Great Depression comes, and it kind of messes up everything. So the Great Depression started in 1930, and it ran about 8 or 9 years, out here to 1938 maybe 39, something like that. Now, think about what Alfred Marshall was saying. Alfred Marshall, or at least the theories that Alfred Marshall put forth, are saying that the economy is made up of thousands of these little supply and demand graphs, right? Thousands of them. And then in the Great Depression, something happens that kind of upsets the apple cart, like maybe this demand curve increases and these two demand curves decrease and this supply curve decreases. You know, stuff happens. But Marshall says that when the dust settles, we will have new equilibriums everywhere. So Alfred Marshall's ideas about how the market works kind of leads people to think, well, the best thing to do is just sort of wait for the dust to settle, and the economy will be okay again. So in 31 we waited, and in 32 we waited some more, in 33 and so forth, and things really didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. So it brought into question the entire premise that comes down from the Marshallian tradition. And the Austrian position was really quite different. The Austrians' position was that people are making their plans based on relative prices, and something has disturbed relative prices that cause their plans to be unrealized. And so they had a very different perspective on the Great Depression, which we will discuss later when we get into the Keynesian model. Anyway, so it creates a vacuum in the science of economics in this period, and in steps this guy, John Maynard Keynes. So he argued that Marshall was incorrect, that the economy would not tend toward equilibrium, that it was not self-correcting, and that the economy required direction, assumably from the government, but somebody to manage and steer the economy. And he used the terms aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In the Keynesian philosophy, it doesn't matter about individual demands for things. All it really matters is all the demand curves somehow added up. So you can imagine how the Austrians thought about this. The Austrians thought Keynes was like a step back, 100-year step back in the advancement of economic science, because they are, after all, about the relative prices and the signals and the way entrepreneurs figure out where there are good business opportunities. And to somehow add up all that stuff was, to them, meaningless. The Keynesian idea prevailed at least until the 1960s. So you get over here to 1960, and we have what's called the golden age of Keynesian economics from 60 to 67, because in this period there was very little division in the profession. Everybody was a Keynesian, or almost everybody was a Keynesian. And so if you were a non-Keynesian, you were kind of hiding in the closet, and people would, you couldn't get promoted, you couldn't get your articles published, and so forth. So there was a famous book published in the 60s called New Dimensions in Political Economy. You don't really need to remember that, by this guy Walter Heller. And he just talked about how the future was so bright, that we had ended forever these kind of the cyclical nature of the economy, that the economists at the helm of the USS economy, you know, like a ship, the economists would be steering the ship between the perilous straits of inflation and unemployment, and using the Keynesian tools of monetary and fiscal policy would keep the economy on an even keel. It's a beautiful image, but of course we all know, living out here in 2015, that he was wrong, that the economy still has periods of expansion and periods of contraction. So that brings us to the present, 2015, and the question is, well, what's out here? What's in the future? And of course we don't know. But I like to think of the future as being indeterminate. You know, some people think of the future as just a continuation of this linear path, like we're sort of stuck on this path and we can't get off of it. But I like to think of the future as being indeterminate. That is that, well, we can make different choices. We can go along this path, or we can go along this path if we make other choices. If we make certain choices, we can have this path, or we can have this path. Right? The future is indeterminate because it depends on the decisions that we make today, and also the decisions we make tomorrow, and so forth. Alright, so this class, Principles of Macroeconomics, is really about Keynes. It's about this area here. But we have to do some background before we can talk about Keynes. So even though the class is mostly about this part, we have to start with supply and demand. So you'll notice in your book, chapters 3 and 4, and I think 5, are about supply and demand. And the rudiments of supply and demand were developed in this period over here, in the Alfred Marshall period, and a little bit before him. So we do this first, then we have our first exam, and then we begin the Keynesian ideas, and then we have our second exam, and then we talk about some of the criticisms of Keynes and so forth. Alright, so in a nutshell, that's the history of economics. I've left out a lot of stuff, but for principles class, that's enough. And I hope you found this helpful. Again, this part is not in the book, but it could show up on an exam, so you should pay attention to this video. Alright, good luck.